Hi. This week on The Encrypted Economy, we had Vasant Dhar, NYU professor, founder of a machine learning hedge fund, and the host of the Brave New World podcast that examines the implications of big data and its collection. Fundamentally, this episode is about the role of government in facilitating and protecting the use of online identities and reputation. Vasant has an interesting perspective on the regulation of social media that is more optimistic than mine, but our underlying concerns are the same. Really, it boils down to weighing risks and desired outcomes, and so we hit it from a few different angles. In many contexts, we are often concerned with the reach of government into our privacy and the abuses of government surveillance powers. Vasant's perspective is that maybe more government regulation is needed to protect our society from the abuses of social media platforms whose conduct may pose greater risks to our society than the abuse of surveillance power. We start off talking about machine learning in trading algorithms, which makes for a smooth segue into algorithms in social media platforms. Easy to see how his earlier experiences translated into where he is today. At any rate, had a lot of fun changing gears a bit for this episode and happy to bring it all to you. Of course, if you like this episode, please share it. And hey, we're making progress. Recently, we were referenced in a SEC commissioner's speech. So clearly, we're getting picked up. At any rate, thanks. And I hope you will enjoy this episode with Vasant. Welcome to The Encrypted Economy, a weekly podcast featuring discussions exploring the business, laws, regulation, security, and technologies relating to digital assets and data. I am Eric Hess, founder of Hess Legal Counsel. I've spent decades representing regulated exchanges, broker-dealers, investment advisors, and all manner of fintech companies for all things touching electronic trading with a focus on new and developing technologies. Welcome, Vasant.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So Vasant is a professor at the Stern School of Business and the Center for Data Science at New York University. He's a former editor-in-chief of the journal Big Data, founder of SCT Capital, which is one of the first machine learning-based hedge funds in New York City in the 90s. He researches based on building scalable decision-making from large sources of data using techniques and principles from AI, machine learning, and he is also the host of the Brave New World podcast. So again, Vasant, I did a little bit of background, but maybe you could go a little deeper and tell us about your journey to where you are today.
Well, I guess maybe I'll just start with the podcast, which is, I'm a big Aldous Huxley fan. Brave New World was one of those. I went to engineering school. I went to the IIT Delhi, and there were two non-engineering books that were assigned to us. One was Brave New World, and the other was Death of a Salesman, both classics. And I've always been an Asimov fan. And, during COVID, it was becoming quite evident to me that humanity was being there was a change being accelerated by sort of the virtualization and tech, and that we're sort of entering a brave new world of tomorrow faster than I had anticipated. So I started the pod just to sort of explore the issues, at the intersection of technology, our changing norms, and how we should think about the world going forward. So I've had a tremendous set of guests so far, and it's been very invigorating, and I'm looking forward to some very interesting guests coming up in the next few weeks, including the presidential candidate Andrew Yang, who will be on my pod in a couple of weeks. So I'm really happy with how things are going. My guests have been awesome, and I'm having a great time. So that's my podcast, but of course it's been a longer journey to sort of get to this point, and we can talk about that to whatever degree you'd like.
So maybe we talk a little bit about SCT Capital and the use of machine learning back in the 90s. So machine learning takes an enormous amount of data to manage, and so certainly must have been a challenge to sort of take in all that data and develop market signals if you're really basing it on machine learning. I mean, there's quantitative trading, but machine learning, I guess, is possibly more data intense, or you tell me.
Yes, the more data you have, the better. And, one of the things I've realized in finance and life in general is that you can never have enough data. It's like you can never be too rich or too thin, and the same applies to data. And in the 90s, the amount of data available was actually a lot less than you have today. And at that time, the only people who had data were banks and telephone companies, essentially. And being in New York City, in a business school, AI had been my area of research since the early 80s when I first got into it through healthcare. And it just seemed to me that there was, tremendous scope for applying a new set of methods to trading, and sort of go beyond sort of the linear models that have been sort of the workhorse of quantitative modeling. So to me, machine learning just offered a new lens into sort of that kind of inquiry. And the way I used to explain machine learning to people at that time was, traditional sort of data analysis used to say, here's a model, here's a set of data, fit this pre-existing linear model to the data, and let's call it a day. Like, what's the R square? What were the coefficients? And that was sort of the interpretation. Whereas I found, and this was actually prior to Wall Street, I'd done a project with AC Nielsen, Nielsen Household Services at that time, where I was analyzing consumer purchase data. And I was playing around with something called genetic algorithms at the time, and I was aware of the fact that with machine learning, you could essentially, the machine would say to you, I've got all this data. If you only knew what question to ask me, I could show you something really interesting, right? And so to me, that was a revelation. Like, wow, I don't know what question to ask, but the machine can actually ask the questions on its own. And sort of that's what really got me into applying machine learning in trading, was these genetic algorithms that sort of, given the data, they'd sort of repeatedly applied queries to it. And as long as you could sort of avoid overfitting, it will find interesting patterns for you. And so my very first sort of foray with the prop trading group at Morgan Stanley was, they gave me a bunch of data. They were already trading, but they were using a trading strategy using something called the Elliott wave theory. And I didn't know that at the time, by the way, because they didn't want to tell me anything. And that was the thing about prop trading on Wall Street, was they wanted to know everything you know, but they didn't want to tell you everything they knew. So I proposed a simple experiment. I told them, give me all the trades you have and I'll tell you if you could have done better. And they said, well, you don't need to know anything about what we do. I said, no, just give me the trades. So they gave me their trades. And, to every trade, I attached some indicators about what the market looked like at that time. What was the volatility? What was the trend? What were the stochastics? So I sort of, applied some standard technical indicators, and I cranked the algorithm. And it came up with a bunch of patterns, similar to sort of what had happened to me in the consumer package space, where I discovered that, older women did a lot of shopping on Thursdays. And the Nielsen guy said, oh, yeah, that's because it's coupon day. And I was just so thrilled, that the machine had found this without me actually explicitly telling it what to find. So here I was 4 years later applying the same sort of machinery. And this time the machine said, oh, when the 30-day volatility is in the lowest quartile, your trades are 3 times as profitable. So I went to the weekly meeting and I sort of told them this, and there was silence around the room for a while, and then expletives, people started cursing each other. And, the head of the group, told the scientist, he says, how come this numbskull who knows nothing about markets is telling us that volatility matters? How long have I been telling you that it matters? So that was sort of, and I asked them, I said, hey guys, can you tell me what's going on? And they said, no, but, we feel that every time volatility spikes, we lose a lot of money. So it's interesting that you're telling us this without knowing anything about what we do. And to me, that was really interesting because I only found the reasons for the pattern many months later when I went into the research into the theory of finance. I actually found the reasons for, what I had found. And so that was sort of my first revelation that patterns often emerge before reasons for them become apparent. And to me, that was a tremendous motivation for using machine learning because, the machine could say, hey, I can tell you the right questions to ask given this data. And in that case, the right question was, what happens when volatility is low? And the answer was, well, your trades are more profitable when volatility is low. So that was my first success because, the group then sort of put a filter on their strategy. Whenever the 30-day volatility was in the lowest quartile, they would crank up the bet size, and it worked. So that was kind of my foray, but I didn't quite realize what a difficult path it would be. So I was, I guess, cursed by some initial success. So that's what sort of got me going, and I've been in the game ever since.
So that's interesting. It's been a number of years since I worked a lot with quantitative trading strategies on the street, and one of the issues that you often encountered was this notion of decay. You would research the heck out of a strategy, and then over time it would decay. So the most successful strategy had a limited life, but you would do a ton of backtesting, and backtesting was always one of those things. It was like, oh, it backtested great, but great. That's because you have perfect vision, but now you actually have to do it in prospectively, where you don't have prospective vision, because you can tweak your algorithm to kill it for the last 10 years, but that doesn't mean that you've got it right for the next year or 6 months or even the next week. It just increases the probabilities. Have quantitative trading strategies evolved to such a point where decay is less of an issue because of the machine learning would actually change the underlying strategy, or do you think that's not really something that's quite actively pursued at this point on the street?
Oh no, decay is very much an issue, and that's something I noticed sort of in the early 2000s as well, which is what sort of got me going towards more of an adaptive strategy, right, where the machine would retrain itself at regular intervals. But this is a problem that's sort of endemic to finance, right? Because it's an adversarial situation, right? Unlike a lot of other problems in AI, like driverless cars, that's not adversarial, right? Cars learn from each other and they get better, right? And everyone wins. But in finance, everyone's trying to screw you, right? They're trying to sort of get the upper hand. If you've got something that works, word gets around, other people copy it, and the word is that, alpha factors turn into risk factors, that is, stuff that gave you an advantage now becomes a risk factor, and that's sort of the name of the game. So it's a constant treadmill that you're on, and anyone who's been in this business for a while will tell you that what they do now bears little resemblance to what they did 5, 10, 15 years ago, right? You just have to keep adapting your strategies, and that's sort of the name of the game. You just have to adapt. So
your podcast talks a lot about the rate of change and technology change. You talk about like the Googles and the Facebooks and the use of big data. And I'm going to just frame this question broadly. So Vasant and I spoke a number of times before this podcast, and we had a great time. And every time we tried to set the call or the communication short, it just naturally expanded because I really enjoy speaking to him, and so we can go on. But when we talk about big data or even things like crypto, and all the rapid technology change in the world. I mean, there's so much that has gone on, even since COVID. It's amazing. I mean, it's almost like you're in the age of, that age of enlightenment that emerged in the historical context with the rate of change. Are governments and the regulations that the government enacts ready for this technological change? Now, I realize this is a broad question, and it may vary by jurisdiction, but have governments been keeping pace?
Well, the short answer is no, but let's back up a little bit, right? Because this is like a really big question, right? Because all of these platforms, right? Google, Facebook, Amazon, they are essentially at the core AI platforms, right? They take in huge amounts of data, right? They apply machine learning. They learn about people. They learn about our behaviors. They learn about our desires, our fears, all kinds of stuff, right? And then they sort of monetize that in some very intelligent ways, right? Now, that's actually fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I want to back up a little bit because I think that, and I think indirectly, what you're getting at is things like Section 230 and, the role of government and, people and big tech, and, how do we sort of get our hands around this animal that is, now, a big part of our lives, and it seems to have had some serious sort of unintended consequences, as technology invariably does, right? So let's back up a little bit here, because I remember this cartoon in the 90s, of two dogs on the internet, and one saying, on the internet no one knows you're a dog. Right? It was anonymous, right? And now it's anything but anonymous, right? And I think the bargain initially with these digital platforms was, hey, you're protected. There's no liability on your platforms. You're just platforms. You're connecting people. You're providing a means for people to exchange information. And now you can also transact and buy things. But you're not really liable for anything on your platform, right? So, and this is like a little bit, I draw the analogy between sort of, the railroads in the 1800s, right? Where the government said, we don't have the capacity to build the railroad. We don't have the resources. This has got to come from private enterprise. The rails have to be laid. But let's have a partnership, right? Let's, for each track of, for each mile of track that you lay, you can have 5 square miles of land for free along the tracks. And as the tracks were laid, the railroad companies started to monetize those because those properties became valuable. I think there's an interesting analogy here in big tech, where the government basically said, you know what, you've got a free pass here to develop this digital railroad, because I don't think it's the role of government to build this, because I'm sure we'll get it wrong, and they probably would have gotten it wrong. Although we have to remember that the internet was not developed by private enterprise. The internet was developed by the US government, right? So that was, taxpayer money, used to develop, the fundamental sort of low-level platform on which everything has been built, right? So that became sort of a public good on which big tech came along, laid the digital railroad, for all of us. But in the process, they got a great bargain, right? They got all of the data for free, right? No one asked them anything, and they didn't ask for permission either, right? They just took it, and now they've become tremendously powerful. And so, and there's all kinds of concerns about, abuse of this data, that we're getting a raw deal. There's surveillance capitalism. There's all this, concern that's come to the surface now around big tech. And, historically, we've always been concerned about the government assuming power, the state assuming power, like Orwellian kinds of notions, like 1984. Where, we don't want government in our affairs, right? We got to keep government out of it. And that makes a lot of sense. My friend James Robinson, who's written this book called Why Nations Fail, and now The Narrow Corridor, talks about, how this Leviathan has to be kept in check, right? I mean, starting with Hobbes and the social contract, that there's got to be sort of a balance between the state and society, right? If the state gets too powerful, as in China, you get this despotic Leviathan, right? If the state gets incredibly weak, right, then you get sort of like an absent Leviathan, right? And anything goes. You have clans, right? And he talks about how America and Western Europe sort of got lucky in a sense, that they've sort of found this balance of power between state and society, where institutions are strong, they're trusted, right? And society keeps government in check, right? And vice versa, right? So there's this sort of delicate balance that we strike in these free and open democracies. That makes a lot of sense, but I don't think I'd envision big tech assuming this role of big brother, right? So, and that's what's really happened. And now we find ourselves in a situation where there's this third actor that's emerged, and that's big tech. And, we don't have the sort of conceptual tools to deal with it, because we've always sort of worried about the state assuming too much power. And now suddenly, big tech has assumed tremendous amount of power, right? And big tech isn't going away anytime soon. They're incredibly powerful, well entrenched. What they do is incredibly complex, right? There's no upstart that's going to come and dislodge Google, anywhere in the short term, right? These are like powerful enterprises that have built the digital railroad, right? And now the question is, what do we do? What do we do about them? Because they've become incredibly powerful, and we need ways to sort of think about sort of striking the right balance of power between the state, society, and big tech, this third actor. And so that's a long answer to a short question, but I just sort of wanted to lay the foundations for what we're talking about, which is that with big tech, we have implicitly this sort of public-private partnership where the government said, all right, build a railroad and use the data, build the infrastructure, and they built it. And to some extent, they've almost become public goods now. I mean, Facebook's sort of become the town square, right? So they've turned into public goods, and they have tremendous amount of power. So you have these public goods being run by private enterprises. So we're in completely uncharted waters here, where we want to be careful about not allowing government to overstep their authority on, private enterprise. But at the same time, government has been incredibly slow to act, and that's sort of where your question started, which is, are they prepared? And the answer is, yeah, they're prepared, but they've been incredibly slow to act. I mean, we know the problems we're facing. I think we all realize that Section 230 must go or must be radically amended, but how that's done isn't entirely clear. And, I draw this analogy to financial services, which we can explore if you want. But so that's the way I see things, right? There's been no KYC, with social media platforms that have, billions of users, arguably. They don't even know who their customers are. They're not motivated to know that. There's bots, there's, rogue governments, manipulating US elections, right? So there's all kinds of crap going on here. And clearly, we need to do something. This is not a situation that can continue, for a long time without other stuff happening that's going to be bad for us. So what I see happening on Capitol Hill is there's some movement, but it's still sort of a show. That there hasn't been sort of sufficient concrete action coming out of lawmakers, and that's a little frustrating, right? And that's what's got to change. So. Sorry for that long-winded answer, but I just needed to set the stage.
Well, to pull on that thread a little bit, you have the big tech's use of data and all the privacy concerns. You have the algorithms that basically, in I guess there's an open question. It's like you want to have full and free speech, but yet when algorithms sort of direct people toward their own particular views as a unbiased search, that potentially raises questions, whether those questions need to be regulated or not, or just people need to be made aware. I guess that's a different question. And then there's even things like the advertising market and the way that the big tech like Google and Facebook will sell their or create their own secondary advertisement market where they control all different segments of the, they're the buyer, they're the seller, they're the market. And that is basically unregulated. So within those ecosystems, there's multiple areas that not only 230 where they've been given immunity, but they've been given functional immunity because of all the other things that they do that in the financial market would be more regulated, or in other markets might find it itself regulated, like in healthcare, even for personal identifiable information. They are lesser regulated in these ecosystems.
Yeah, you talked about free speech, right? Free speech in the physical world means people know who you are. Yes, you can speak freely, but you're not speaking from behind a billboard when no one can see you, right? It's free speech, but hey, Eric Hess says, I think we should do this. Well, everyone knows that Eric Hess said that, right? I'm all for that. That's free speech. But, and that's what sort of Facebook hides behind. But that's not free speech. It's not free speech when you've got, some bot out of Russia, saying something, and then another bot saying, yeah, and then, an army of trolls saying something, and then Facebook's algorithm picking that up and amplifying it because it generates engagement. That's not free speech. That is anything but free speech. It's very opaque speech, and it might maximize engagement, but that's bad for everyone. That's bad for society. It's bad for us anyway. Maybe great for Russia. Maybe great for Facebook because this vitriolic content generates engagement, but it's not good for society, right? So I don't buy this free speech argument. I've proposed for a long time that social media platforms be subject to KYC requirements, right? They should know their users, just like other businesses, banks, right? And you open a bank account, they want to know everything about you. They want to know you. I think the same thing needs to apply on social media, right? I mean, on the internet. And I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that the internet is this anonymous space, right? It cannot be that way. The potential for destructive harm is just too great, to allow people to, speak from behind billboards and stuff like that in the name of free speech. That ain't free speech.
So I have a confession to make. I've never made this confession, so people can start throwing eggs at me. So I had a cybersecurity company, and along the way, I wanted to deploy different people to help market my company. So I briefly retained somebody who was supposed to promote my profile on Instagram and various sources, and I just couldn't continue because the profiles that were utilized were, and this was somebody who was in Bangladesh. I had an office in Bangladesh, but I just seemed to do a lot of work in that region for a while. But he was going out as an American housewife, different profile, and she was holding a baby, and I'm just like, I just can't do this. This is so bad. Like, I know it's just a picture, but come on, it just, it wasn't like he was saying, in my hometown, I listened to it didn't even make any sense on some level, but it definitely gave sort of a different stature to this person. And for somebody who is unsophisticated, they may think that's actually who the person they're dealing with, but in fact, they're not. Now, should that be regulated, or should people just demand that social media do that? It's a tricky question. We can spend a lot of time debating it, but that's just like one example. And the other point that you made, just to kind of continue on that thread, is this notion of taking an identity, presuming to be an actual human being with a different background, with a different profile that actually isn't yours. And that's one. And the other one is this notion of a bot, where the bot just sort of assumes this identity, and a bot assumes another level of discourse. And it all seems like a genuine discussion with opinions going back and forth and sort of formulating a view or a perspective, but it's all designed to manipulate, to make it appear that there's this other conversation going on. Yeah, no, exactly.
Americans sort of recoil at the word regulation, right? Sort of, there's this instinct, sort of recoil. And I remember when I know it was 2016 or 2017, but I first proposed that social media platforms be subject to KYC regulation, right? There was, and my post went on Zero Hedge, and all kinds of things. And I got all of this hate mail saying, I think you should go to China, or I think you should go to England, or, countries where they don't have, freedom of speech and all that kind of stuff. But I think, what Americans don't realize often is that our financial system is trusted for one reason, and that is that it is the most highly regulated system in the world, right? You deposit your money in a bank, right? I mean, you can be reasonably sure, almost entirely sure, that someone isn't going to walk away with it, right? I mean, these things, the trust in the financial system is there because we've gone sort of through this painstaking process of figuring out, how things can be manipulated, how people can favor one customer over another. And by the way, I worked on Wall Street, and Wall Street was full of these kinds of conflicts of interest, right? And they eventually got regulated, and with the intention of creating a more level playing field. And this is something we sort of forget oftentimes, is that we have the most trusted financial system in the world because we feel that our money is safe, right? That there isn't going to be wrongdoing, et cetera, et cetera. It still happens, but it's because it's regulated, right? So I understand this sort of visceral, reaction to the word regulation, but the other side to it is that it's meant to protect people, right? And that's where and that's what where the trick is. How do you sort of have the right level of regulation? It's not like regulation is bad, right? Oftentimes regulation has unintended sort of consequences, right? We can see that, right? So that certainly happens, but that's sort of the challenge for lawmakers is to sort of find that right balance. And so while I might criticize them for acting too slowly, I sort of appreciate the fact that they have to tread carefully because of sort of unintended consequences of regulation as well, right? So I sort of have a somewhat balanced, I try and have a balanced view towards regulation, because I think on balance we're looking for regulation that protects us and avoids this kind of fraudulent dialogue, that you were talking about, because that's what we've been seeing on the internet, right? That's what we've been seeing with social media platforms. When I talked to Sanana Rao, that was the first question I asked him is, are we being manipulated by algorithms, right? And the answer is yes, we are.
But when we talk about KYC, and I know you don't mean necessarily, give me your utility bill and prove that you've been a resident for the last 3 months and send me a copy of your passport and all these things. But nonetheless, even the act of proving that you're that person, you would have to, if let's say it was required, you would have to prove this even more personal information to Facebook or Google or whomever, and presumably they would be the ones taking it in unless you created some sort of singular, fully encrypted repository, but you ultimately are now sharing more personal information with presumably a technology company that has been exploiting that information all along. So isn't there sort of an inherent conflict in that?
Well, what's the difference between sharing showing your bank that you're that who you are who you say you are, and a social media platform where you're required to, right? I mean, we require that with banks, right? Why can't we require? I mean, what's wrong with authentication, right? I mean, it doesn't mean you're not allowed to use a pseudonym. Sure, you can, right? But as long as Facebook knows you're Eric Hess, right? And that you're a resident of whatever it is, well, that's KYC. Now that doesn't mean that they're allowed to use your information for all kinds of nefarious purposes, but they should be required to use it for authenticating people. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Right?
I think the issue would be to the extent that they actually had the information in an unencrypted format. I mean, you could do a zero knowledge proof. The other thing that's kind of curious is because we just did an episode with Victor from Humanode, founder of Humanode. Humanode has this proof of a human existence algorithm. It's really contemplated more for governance to make sure that you don't have like a Sybil attack in a voting mechanism. And what they basically do is they have there's a liveness detection mechanism for a particular voter, so that that you're a human as opposed to a bot, and it avoids the risk of multiple bots voting to create sort of this, because if you have one token holder, one vote, then somebody could presumably just create a ton of bots holding small token, one token, and then they would all have the equivalent vote, and then they could basically still manipulate. So the notion of human existence verification, and to make sure that it's unique, that's something that would be built into it. And then there's this periodic method of where you'd have to verify. So now, imposing this on like a Google or a Facebook's probably ridiculous, but could you envision a world where there is a distinction between a user on a social media platform that chooses to be verified or unverified? Like, you could still be a bot, you could still be a criminal actor posing to be as an American housewife when you're really a prison guard in some despotic country, but at least the person who is ingesting the information or viewing it would know that this was unverified and thus potentially not worthy of the same level of trust as something that has been verified.
That's a really interesting question, and I think you sort of answered the question yourself, right? So you're basically saying, okay, they verified that you're a human, but beyond that, you don't want to say anything about your identity. I think that's fair enough, but in that case, maybe you should be prevented from posting anything, or beyond like pictures to show you're, making pizza or you're at a restaurant or something like that, right? So, maybe there's a way to assign, different levels of permission depending on to the degree to which you've been authenticated, right? I mean, I haven't really thought about this before, but that certainly seems like a possibility, right? So if you don't want to say who you are, well, then you're assigned sort of a minimum level of, capability on that platform. You're level 1, right? But if you really want to post opinions and, start sort of influencing people, which is perfectly legitimate, right? That there's nothing wrong with people wanting to influence people, but then you authenticate yourself, right? I don't think that's unreasonable.
Or do you think maybe it's something that private industry, ultimately deals with themselves? Like certain forums are the ones that are potentially verified, because ultimately, if it's like children, because there's a lot of children on these platforms, whether or not they should be, I guess, is a different question, depending on how old they are. But if you're like 15 years old and you're posting on, I guess, I don't know, can 15-year-olds post on Facebook? I don't even know. I think they can, or at least Instagram. But they're not going to go through, they're just kids. But by the same token, and I think maybe this becomes even more of an issue when you deal with platform where it is sort of completely unedited and you have a lot more kids on it.
Look, you're raising something that is incredibly important, right? Kids on the internet, right? We know that we can be manipulated by algorithms, right? We know that. Right? I mean, that train has left the station, right? I think the same kind of laws that apply to tobacco and alcohol, right? The last time I checked, you couldn't buy alcohol if you're under what?
21?
18, 21, 18, I don't know, whatever, right? But tobacco. I don't think you can buy cigarettes, right, as a kid, right? One of my guests in a recent pod, Dina Srinivasan, reminded me that cigarette companies used to hand out cigarettes for free, right? To create addiction, right? Because they knew tobacco was addictive, right? So they were truly evil, right? So for decades, they denied that tobacco had any kind of addictive properties when they knew that it did, right? Now, I'm not accusing social media platforms of being evil, right? Some people do. I'm not accusing them of being evil. I think there are unintended consequences that happen. But I think that, until we had the smoking gun 40, 50 years later, right? Every study showed, the harmful effects of smoking, and now you get cigarette packets with skulls and crossbones, saying this is poison, it'll kill you, right? And if you still want to consume it, be my guest, right? We're not in that dissimilar situation with some of these social media platforms. They can cause tremendous amount of harm to kids, right? So, and this is a role for government, right, to protect kids, because, now, social media platforms will hide behind, well, we don't have enough data. Show me the science, that shows that kids are affected. Unless we have a sample size of 2 million and a longitudinal study over 20 years, this isn't provable, right? Same thing with tobacco, right? The risks of that are way too high, right? By the time we get that smoking gun, it'll be too late, or it could be too late, right? So I think we have to tread really carefully here, right? When it comes to social media platforms for kids, Instagram for kids, all this kind of stuff. It's wrapped up in sort of nice looking wrappers, but you really need to be careful. So I think we need to think about minimum age, before you can be on these platforms. And so we need to think of laws similar to how we think of alcohol and tobacco, because, there's similar kinds of impacts that can occur on kids. You talk about advertising. Same thing, right? The digital advertising market completely befuddles me, right? Because we've got the financial market, in front of us. We can see what happens, right? You can't have someone operating an exchange and being a buyer's broker or seller's broker at the same time, right? Not possible. Yet it's free for all in the digital space, and to some extent it's sort of the tech language and obfuscation that somehow tech is different, right? And the fact that lawmakers are maybe in their 50s and 60s and 70s, and more, and sort of grew up without the tech, don't understand the language, right? So we've had all of this stuff happen, so sort of, big tech's gotten the free pass, but I think it's time to wake up.
But let me ask this question, though. Because of the global nature of it, and certainly the digital asset space itself also sees this, to the extent you regulate it and make it difficult for some of these practices to occur onshore, does that just encourage offshore marketplaces that, to do the same thing? I mean, absent the Great Firewall like they have in China, how do you actually prevent, platforms from becoming popular that don't have all these controls, and they actually might be more enticing still to different groups of society? I mean, if you're talking about children, but even outside, there's parents, there's the schools, there's education. Is it something that the governments really can ultimately control?
Well, I sort of cringe at the term control. Right?
Control is a bad word.
Because that's a bad word, right? That just like smells of like, you're infringing on people's rights. And so I try...
A question withdrawn. I will go with the effectively regulate.
Yeah, so, to me, that is much more palatable, right? But I think there is some role for government to ensure that, the right kinds of incentives are in place, there's a level playing field, that people don't get manipulated, that they're protected, that there isn't, rife fraud, because that just undermines trust, and it, undermines institutions that you need in order, to have an effectively functioning, free market democracy, right? You need some sort of trust in institutions. Now, this might be sort of a good segue, into, sort of the whole world of crypto and all of that. But, I think that, viewing crypto in terms of sort of counterculture and I don't trust the government isn't the right way to look at crypto. I think there's some tremendous benefits to crypto and the underlying technology, but, that doesn't, but that doesn't get you away from, the need to, protect investors, to protect people who, from being defrauded and things like that, which are ultimately the goals of regulation. And, with crypto, it's sort of somewhat in its Wild West days, right? But I don't think there necessarily needs to be this adversarial kind of situation between crypto and institutions. I think the two need to exist in a way that promotes trust. It is sort of the simplest way I can put it.
Yeah, I mean the U.S. is certainly a little challenged when it comes to figuring out how they're going to regulate it. Despite all the activity, there's a press to be regulated as a security, but
it is. Yeah. No, it
may
is.
They may not always be possible, depending on the interaction of programmable money with utility, or a lot of these platforms may actually legitimately be decentralized. So how do you impose a whole registration regime? But you may find, even with the big social media companies, in trying to figure out that right mix, it's really what the outcome is. Because certainly at the end of the day, you don't want like an offshore social media platform somehow arbitraging all the advantages it gets by not being in a regulated jurisdiction, but yet getting all the traffic, all the people flocking there for it.
Yeah, I think a lot more about the crypto space than I do. But I certainly see the need for a lot of, or rather the scope for like tremendous efficiencies being realized, through different, payment mechanisms. We still use sort of antiquated networks like SWIFT to settle transactions that, take 5 days and have, incredible error rates and stuff like that. I see a lot of that stuff being replaced by, these, cleaner protocols, than these proprietary protocols where you don't need intermediaries, right? So I totally get the need for that, and there's tremendous efficiencies, to be realized in that space. I realize that there's tremendous confusion at the moment around, what's a security, what isn't a security, and all that kind of stuff. But assuming that Gensler gets some clarity on this, sooner rather than later, maybe we'll begin to make some progress, where there can be more trust and transparency in this crypto space as well.
Yeah. With all these things, there's always a danger of politicization as well, where it starts to become sort of a Republican Democrat type thing. And that's probably one of the more concerning aspects of digital asset regulation, is to see it sort of start to take on private party lines. Do you think there's a risk of that when it comes to social media, big tech? Do you think there's going to be sort of a, one side picks its battle and the other side just opposes it? Or do you think it's going to be more bipartisan in how it's approached?
I think it'll eventually become more bipartisan, but at the moment, the sort of show you're seeing on Capitol Hill is, are these platforms, do they lean red? Do they lean blue? And as my friend Scott Galloway said, they lean green. Like whatever makes them money, they lean that way. So really, it is a bipartisan thing, and I think eventually we'll get our act together.
Well, good to hear. So let's shift gears a little bit to Web30. Is that something where, in your view, is that something where there should be regulation, or do you think it pretty much, that one of the primary benefits of Web30 is that it disentangles some of the big tech companies' control over the data? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know. So let's define Web30, right? So how do you look at Web30? Because I look at it as sort of an extension of Web2.0, but with sort of to borrow sort of the Bill Gates sort of information at your fingertips, but then you're also at everyone else's fingertips. So to me, it seems like this internet with sort of more intelligence, more stuff on the cloud, more fluidity in terms of data, just more intelligence about things. But how do you view it? Like, how do you define Web30 before we go into its sort of implications and risks and opportunities?
Well, I think one of the core things, and I recognize that Web3.0 has become sort of a catch term for the next age of the internet. And, some would define it as the ability to sort of bring your own wallet with you online. Now, wallet, that could be associated with programmable money, but I mean, even in a simpler context in terms of your own identity, your own data. So where the user has, you would argue, more control. Like, for example, in Brave, you can choose to be open to different advertisements. You can sort of moderate what you want to expose yourself to or how you want to monetize your own activity, and you get rewarded for doing so. But it recognizes that the user has sort of, fundamentally, the user has an identity. That identity captured inside of a wallet. That wallet can contain both programmable money, but more fundamentally, it's digital identity and the ability to better manage the digital identity or to program the digital identity to interact with the internet, as opposed to just being a surfer popping from site to site and potentially being tracked by a large company, but not having all those tools or abilities yourself, whether yourself directly or through a third-party intermediary.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm talking to you from Switzerland. I came here last week, and I was just thinking. I went through JFK, and spent like 2.5 hours in various lines before boarding the plane, right? And that just seems incredibly inefficient, right? And I could just envision a few years from now where you just kind of walk right through, maybe something scans your iris and, boom, 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 you're kind of on the plane, right? Your bags get checked in. I mean, to me, that's like, smells like Web30. Now, I'll go take this example of India. India doesn't often get things right, but it's interesting to see what's happening there in terms of how some of the thinking about the internet and data and privacy and sort of empowering the user. So in 2009, India started this Aadhaar project, which is, you can be authenticated in real time. Only country in the world where this sort of capability exists. Where you can authenticate, which is essentially, are you who you say you are, right? In real time, right? Biometric, right? And it sounds creepy and control and all that kind of stuff. But in India, it was motivated
and notably government administered.
Government
private partnership.
Government administered, but there's no data about you recorded by the government, such as other than the biometrics. They don't know where you live or what you do for a living. There's no other data, right? The only thing that platform does is one simple thing, which is authentication, right? Now in India, it was driven by the need for people to have identity, right? Because you're talking about digital identity. Right? Now in the West, we're used to, birth certificates or, social security numbers or things like that have been used as our identity, right? But now, in India, you had 600 million people who didn't have an identity. The government didn't even know these people existed, right? And so these people couldn't really participate in the sort of economic sort of mainstream, right? They didn't have identity, they didn't have a bank account, right? And pretty much overnight, that was transformed, right? That platform now has 1.3 billion users, like it's the largest authentication platform on the planet, right? And people are authenticated in real time. Now, what did it do? Well, the guy who sells coconuts on the street, right? Earlier, he'd get a loan at 100% interest rate from a loan shark, right? Now, the guy accepts Google Pay, right? And he can go to a platform. So India's sort of introduced this notion of a data fiduciary, right? Just like you have a fiduciary in finance, right? So there's a platform, which is a data fiduciary, and that coconut vendor can go to this platform and say, make my transactions, all of my Google Pay transactions, available to Axis Bank for 1 month. And, because I want a loan, that thing is reviewed and the guy gets a loan in 10 minutes. Boom, it's deposited into his account, right? Now that's happening in a place like India, right? You don't tend to think of India as being sort of innovative in most things, right? But this was sort of a late mover advantage, and it came from the need for inclusion, which required people to have a digital identity. And now that digital identity can be used for all kinds of purposes that actually benefit the individual who previously was completely out of the economic mainstream, right? So the same thing has happened with payments, right? So payments is now a platform that isn't run by a government, but it's regulated by a government, right? The same way with these data fiduciaries. They're not run by the government, but they're regulated by the government. And it's a sort of new way of thinking about, and they call it the data empowerment and protection architecture. I think that's what it's called. But the basic idea is that users are in control of their data, right? And in a sense, it's the first information market in the world, right? Where, and this notion of information markets has been around for a long time. My late colleague Ken Loudon actually first proposed it, I think in 1996 or something, that there should be information markets, right, where people are able to transact and sell their information, where people put a value on it, right? And he proposed this notion of information markets that was actually picked up by people like Hal Varian, who was the chief economist of Google several years later. And so this data empowerment architecture is sort of the first, information market I see. And that's an interesting way to go, where you put users in charge and in control of their data, and they can monetize it, right? People are willing to pay for that data to make you a loan because they're going to make money off that loan, right? So it's an interesting idea, and sort of that's the way I look at, as Web 3.0 is sort of this, very fluid kind of an architecture where sort of physical collateral has been replaced by information collateral, right? I mean, banks use a lot of proxies to figure out whether you're risky. What do you own? Do you own a house? Well, they could, if they could look at your transactions, they could maybe assess your credit risk even better, right? But they can't, because we don't have the systems in place to do that in a really fluid kind of way, because our systems have evolved sort of piecemeal, from a different era. I still write checks, by the way. I still write 5 or 6 checks a month, right? I mean, in Europe, that's that seems like a Neanderthal kind of age. So, right. So in the U.S., we've sort of got this patchwork of systems, and in a sense, we're sort of cursed with first mover advantage, and now forced to sort of try and integrate all of these different patchworks of systems, into something more coherent.
And so you raised the point about a marketplace for data, which is one of the things that I think Brave is also based on, which is the notion that you make your data available and you get paid for others using your data. A number of years ago, somebody had come to me and asked me to work with them, represent them in my legal capacity, in creating a company where people would put their data up for, like, same thing, they would elect, and that data would be monetized. They'd get a check into their wallet, not a check, but they'd get paid. A marketplace could develop over time. Certain people could make more money. Like, for example, presumably my data would be more valuable than somebody who was like 18 and had a lower income, just unless that person was a spendthrift or whatever. But potentially I'm a better whatever, or I could be worse than somebody else. I'm not. There's no elitism there. But the point being is that you'd have different value metrics. But one of my points was always that the people who don't value their data generally aren't the ones whose data is all that valuable. Whereas those who do value their data are much less likely to offer their data up to be monetized, to be like harvested as part of a data aggregation to figure out how to better position products for them. Is that what you're talking about when you talk about the data marketplace? Or you just mean it more in the context of financial transactions or things like that?
No. I do mean that. In fact, I think it was like 2013, I wrote an article in Wired, which said, get paid for your data on Facebook, right? So actually, and I went on CNBC, and I think it was Brian Sullivan and Henry Blodgett, and we sort of maybe Becky Quick, if I remember correctly. Right? So we discussed this idea, right? And they said, like, is this a crazy idea or does it make sense? And I actually proposed that Facebook should actually create an information market where they pay people for data if that data leads to a transaction, right? So if you're into running, and they connect you with Nike and you buy a pair of shoes, maybe Facebook should get a piece of the action, right? So I'd propose that. But I think the idea was too early for its time. And I think the mentality at that point in Facebook was more along the lines of sort of, Zuckerberg's earlier comment about people being dumb fucks for sharing their data, right? Excuse the French, right? But I think at that time, the thinking was, are you crazy? What the hell should we pay people for anything? They're providing it to us for free, right? Right? Like, are you crazy? Like, that's the craziest idea, right? But I think that we may have been in a very different place now, if Facebook had actually gone down that path of saying, you know what, we're monetizing this data. We're making a ton of money. Let's share it, right? And I remember in the late 90s asking the head of credit card operations at Citibank, saying, you're making money off these people. Wouldn't it be nice to share it? And he said it would be. It would be a great thing to do. But the infrastructure doesn't exist, to do that, right? And this was like 90s. So I think it's a good idea, but it would be like too messy to be able to do that. I think Facebook could have done it, I think these digital platforms could have done it, but I think they were just too greedy, right? And they just went down a path, a darker path of just exploitation of data, manipulation through algorithms, and look where it's gotten them.
Well, and where do you think it ultimately really goes? I mean, is it window dressing? I know that Google and Facebook and some of the big tech companies are now engaged in I mean, they certainly have more privacy controls that they're implementing. They say that about specific human data, right? Like, specific individual data. They say they won't sell the individual data. And they're also exploring Web30. But here's the thing. They don't even need the individual data anymore, right? They have all this data. All they have to do is create a composite. Personally identifiable information for a large tech company becomes actually less important. They can extract all the same data that is similarly intrusive on, you could say privacy without even necessarily having the individually identifiable information.
That's right. In fact, that's exactly what they've done, right? I mean, the acquisition of DoubleClick by Google was, exactly, motivated by exactly that kind of stuff, right? I mean, they cookied the most people, and eventually, triangulated on the identity. Now they can connect your online behavior with your offline behavior, right? The ability to get into your home. So, I mean, in a sense, you're right that's already happened. But I think going forward, it's still important to put the right checks and balances in place, because I think over time that information, will, you're absolutely right. Part of it is already game over, but that doesn't mean that it should continue to be that way. I think that it's still important to put into place the right kind of regulation going forward. Recognizing that a lot of this is, in some sense, already too late. In fact, that's one of the reasons I guess Facebook is concerned about Apple's new policies around privacy and clamping down, because it suddenly turns off this one of the spigots, so it makes things more difficult for them. But I think that's a step in the right direction.
And so do you think ultimately it's really more about how people become more educated, and the more educated preferences migrate towards systems where their data isn't going to be exploited in the same way, or at least on its face, and then there's still people who just don't care, what you talked about, the Mark Zuckerberg's dumb persons who just don't care enough about their data. Is that ultimately where we go or should go, or do you think the notion of effective regulation in that context still makes sense?
No, I think I think effective regulation still makes sense. I think we need to think seriously about. Each. It's hard to characterize all of big tech with the same broad brush, because the issues are different for Google than they are for Facebook, and I think we can tackle them, one at a time, right? For Google, it's, they basically, are dominating the largest, digital market in the world, the digital advertising market, because they're on the exchange, they're brokers on both sides, right? So for Google, it's a separate set of issues than is, for Facebook. So I think each one of these companies requires a different approach. It's hard to sort of characterize them with the same broad brush, right? But I think it is possible to deal with each of them separately, right? With Facebook and social media platforms above a certain size, I think it should be KYC. I think there should be more transparency, but I also think it requires the definition of laws. I mean, one of the things we have in finance is clearly defined laws. You can't manipulate the marketplace. You can't favor customers, right? We've defined these laws. What are these laws when it comes to, society, right? So, on the one hand, I say, yeah, we should have transparency, but transparency to what end, right? I think the transparency should have an end, namely, the mental health of the population, right? I mean, we don't want to be, having algorithms leading to teen depression, right? So I think we can broadly define sort of, what we want to accomplish, right? So mental health of the population. Let's say, not manipulating the democratic process. At the moment, we don't even have rules around this. There are no laws that say that you're not allowed to subvert the democratic process. There's no laws around that. There's no laws around, that, you can have algorithms that lead to, mass scale depression. There are no laws, right? So I think lawmakers need to sit down and define, in broad brush strokes, what are the laws, and then define transparency and regulation around those laws, right? So both of those things have to come, simultaneously. It doesn't make sense to, talk about transparency without an idea about, transparency towards what end, right? So we need to define the ends, which is, the laws, and then craft the regulation accordingly, just like we've done in financial services, where things seem to work pretty darn well. We've defined the laws. The regulators know what they're looking for. My hedge fund has been, regulators have shown up twice. And they've said, oh, show us that your trades are not favoring clients. And I say, okay, for what period do you want them? Well, we want them for these years. Show us what prices different people got and show us that you're not favoring clients. I can show them that, right? So they know what they're looking for. We need similar kinds of laws when it comes to, these large-scale platforms. What are we concerned about? What are the fears? What are the risks? Once we define that, then we can start, crafting sensible regulation around that. At the moment, lawmakers are sort of, they've got two left feet in terms of like even trying to define these laws.
And so do you envision like maybe advertisers or those who are leveraging the data sets that we have, like we have KYC potentially on the users who, and maybe when they start posting beyond a certain point, it requires a different level of, assuring that they are who they claim to be or that they're not a bot. Do you also envision a similar regulation, maybe like a conflicts within or conflicts of interest or where advertisers are paying for access to these platforms or people are paying for access to these platforms, that there's a better understanding of, who they are, similar KYC requirements on that side where they're actually paying to promote?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this isn't rocket science, right? I mean, the financial industry isn't rocket science. They're very simple objectives, right? Protecting customers, level playing field, no market manipulation, very simple objectives, right?
But not simple rules.
No, not simple rules. The objectives are simple, but in fact, you're raising a really good point, right? What this means changes according to the technology, right? Even in the financial services, right? Protecting customers meant something different 30 years ago than it does now because of the technology, right? So you're exactly right. I think the objectives can stay the same, but the methods have to keep up with the technology and adapt. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's just natural.
Excellent. So Vasant, we're pretty much closing in on the end of our time here. It's been phenomenal. I feel like we could keep going. Anything that you want to kind of close with that you don't feel like you've certainly gotten to in this conversation?
No, I thank you for having me on the pod. I've really enjoyed it, and I would ask your listeners to tune into my podcast, Brave New World. It's on bravenewpodcast.com. I have, like I said, tremendous set of guests, invigorating conversations, and my only promise is I will make it worth your while for that 60 minutes. You'll come away with something new.
Yeah, I have the Brave New World on my playlist now, and I think I've listened to every single one and maybe a couple twice. So it's been great. So again, Vasant, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It was great to have you. And where so people can find Brave New World, I guess it's like the Encrypted Economy. It's on every player. It's very easy to pull up. You type in a Brave New World, Vasant Dhar. Where can they find out about other things that you've written or published or about you personally?
Oh, I'm very easy to find. You just type my name into Google, and everything comes up. Some of the things that even I don't want people to know. So it's
no
all
privacy.
Yep.
That's why he's all in favor. That's why he's in favor of regulation. Just kidding. Anyway, Vasant, thanks so much. It was great to have you.
Likewise, a pleasure, Eric. Thanks.